I'm Sally Shuttleworth. I'm Professor of English Literature at the University of Oxford, and I work on the Victorian period and the concerns they had about the speed of life and the pressures of modernity, which I think has a lot to tell us about our current concerns.
I'm Russell Foster. I'm Professor of Circadian Neuroscience here at the University of Oxford. I also direct the Sleep and Circadian Neuroscience Institute. And I'm interested in the mechanisms whereby sleep and circadian rhythms, these 24-hour body clocks, are generated, how they're regulated, and what happens when these systems fall apart as a result of disease or societal pressures. So, Sally, what did the Victorians know about sleep, and what were their attitudes or indeed concerns about sleep?
I think that the Victorian attitudes to sleep started to shift around the 1850s, in part because that was the beginnings of experimental studies on both the human and the animal body regarding sleep, but also because they started to become very aware of the pressures of modernity. This is the coming of the railways, the telegraph, and also the concerns about industrialisation. And so life seemed to be dominated by change, by speed, by new ways of doing things, and this affected the way in which they thought about the value of sleep. Interestingly, not so much for the working classes, who were working extraordinary hours in the factories, which were overturning the whole concept of night and day, but also they seemed to be more concerned about the middle classes and what they called the brain workers, those who were now in their offices but could be required to work late into the night. And the other category of people that they were really interested in was school children. And there were wonderful debates about overpressure on the school child and the problems that the child had from being asked to do too much work.
Goodness, so nothing really has changed very much. One quick further question. William Morris, the great thinker of the 19th century, influenced so much of the aesthetic and the artistic movement. Did he speak very much about sleep?
Yes, he did, because for him sleep was part of the going back to a more natural mode of life. There were quite a few people who were talking about the ways in which the rhythms of life were being completely transformed, because the other thing I didn't mention, of course, is the gas lighting. Yeah. And then at the end of the century, the electric light. So suddenly you could start staying up half the night should you wish, and so overturning what was seen as natural rhythm. So Morris was part of a whole movement that were concerned about this movement away from nature.
So by the end of the 19th century we really had invaded the night efficiently, and of course sleep, I guess, was the first victim.
Definitely, yes. And perhaps just to say a bit more about the school children, which I think people might be interested in. It all started, interestingly, with a novel by Dickens, Dombey and Son, in 1848, where he talks about Dr. Blimber's academy, which has what he calls a forcing apparatus, which produced green peas in the middle of the winter and asparagus. So it's forcing the poor children. And he talks about all these children sort of having nightmares and reciting Latin in their sleep. And from then on, you get all sorts of pamphlets and concerns. There's a wonderful description by a doctor called Brudenell Carter on the artificial production of stupidity in schools from 1859, which talks about the ways in which schools are just overworking the children and producing people who can't think.
I'm interested by the word forcing, because, of course, was that due to the use of glass houses and the forcing of vegetables, out of season, and the growth of tomatoes and asparagus and all that sort of thing. So it was a direct parallel to the forcing of vegetables.
Yes. So the notion that children were being pushed outside of natural growth cycles, and then there's long descriptions of them working till 10, even midnight, on their books. And then in the 1880s, you get what's called the overpressure controversy, and brain forcing becomes an area that there's parliamentary commissions on it. And lots of people band together, so the MPs, doctors, teachers, and write petitions saying that we are ruining the lives of our children by forcing them to study too much.
That's fascinating.
So Russell, how do you think that our understanding and knowledge about sleep has changed through the insights gained from modern research? And indeed, what myths do you think have been dispelled, if any?
Where to start? Well, I suppose we've been studying sleep seriously for about 60 years or so, but the methodology has been essentially to apply electrodes to the surface of the skull and to record the gross electrical activity from the surface of the skull arising from that bit of the brain called the cortex. And it's been essentially to define different sleep states, so REM sleep versus slow wave sleep, non-REM sleep. But beyond that, we didn't learn a huge amount. It was a lot of phenomenology. What's happened over the past 15, 20 years is that as a result of animal models and indeed of brain imaging studies, we've learnt that sleep is the product of an interaction of all the key brain neurotransmitter systems and multiple brain structures. So the hindbrain, the midbrain, the hypothalamus in the deep brain, the cortex are all interacting to drive these profoundly different states of consciousness and sleep. And so we're gaining real insight how this sort of global part of our biology has been regulated by the brain. So it's changed a great deal over the past few years. And I suppose the historical myths that have been dispelled have been quite interesting. I mean, sleep, I guess, up until the 1980s was regarded as an indulgence or a sort of something that one should do as a luxury, perhaps. And, people come to work and say, I've done another all-nighter. They get a slap on the back. And the realization now that is absolutely absurd. Our ability to function during the waking state is defined by the quality of sleep that we had at night. Our ability to lay down facts and memories are profoundly influenced by a good night of sleep. And it's not just the retention of information, but it's also the processing of information, such that if we want to come up with novel solutions to complex problems, then a night of sleep has been shown to hugely enhance our capacity to come up with solutions to problems. And so it's gone from an indulgence and a luxury to the realization that this is a fundamental part of our biology and we ignore sleep at our peril.
That's really interesting and comforting as well to know that we can actually insist that we have our sleep. I think there's very interesting parallels there with the Victorian period, because they, in their concerns about overwork, really insisted that the quality of sleep was important. So there's a wonderful example of Gladstone when he was Prime Minister, and he had just a few weeks when he wasn't sleeping, and the doctor came in and ordered him off to Cannes for a holiday, which then extended into months, and actually he ruled England from Cannes for a few weeks, because it was so important that you got your sleep. And I think, in a way, that they were thinking about sleep in its relation to all external pressures in ways that are now we're coming back to almost.
It does seem like that, yes. Yes, it's surprising, yeah. As with so many things, the Victorians invented much of the modern world, and we forgot, I think, the importance of sleep for a good 50 years.
Yes.
One thing that's puzzled me is, how did the Victorians study sleep?
I think various methods. First of all, in the 1850s, there was a patient who had had a brain injury, which opened up his brain, and a doctor actually studied what was happening, because you could see through into the secrets of the brain. And after that, there were various doctors who then started, as soon as someone had an injury, they'd be there trying to recruit them into their experimental studies. And one of the main ones was someone called Angelo Mosso, who writes wonderful books on this for a general audience. But he talks about the first time that they actually wired up this patient in the middle of the night and watched him sleeping. And it was wired up so that the pulse of the brain actually caused a pen to write on a graph. So it was the first recording of a brain pulse. And what they discovered was that although he seemed to be sound asleep, actually each time somebody coughed or moved or a bell rang outside, the pulses registered. And so they became very interested in the way in which the mind was functioning whilst the body was asleep.
Because sleep researchers tend to think of the origins of the systematic study of sleep as being in the 50s and the 60s. But what you're saying is that actually, essentially the recording of electrical activity was much, much earlier. And so we should give credit again to our Victorian ancestors for that.
Yes.
I think also what's fascinating is that although the methodologies have moved on, as you were referring to this person whose brain was even being observed as a result of injury, and we these days can look at the brain activity using mRNA. But despite all these technological advances, there are fundamental questions about sleep that remain. So the classic different states of sleep, both REM versus non-REM and slow wave sleep, we've only got a very rudimentary understanding of what's going on within the brain. And broadly speaking, people are suggesting that memory consolidation and the processing of information is going on during deep sleep, slow wave sleep, whereas REM sleep has been associated with emotional processing. Whether that's going to turn out to be real is unclear. And indeed, so many sort of things that we took for granted are now being dispelled. So there's a wonderful structure deep within the hypothalamus called the VELPO, or the ventrolateral preoptic nuclei. And these were thought to be the structure within the hypothalamus, which when turned on would activate sleep. And what's happened most recently is people are now saying, it's a bit more complicated than that, because this structure, when activated, can both turn on sleep and turn off sleep. So, long-held truths are being dispelled all the time as a result of our advancing understanding of the mechanisms that drive sleep. And as you were saying, as the Victorians used people with health problems and brain lesions to try and understand the mechanisms, we're doing very similar things today.
Yeah, it is fascinating, and I often find that the Victorians were in the beginnings of neurophysiology, and they were convinced they were going to solve everything. I think they're quite interesting problems now that people have been saying, oh, well, we will find, but actually what you find are more problems in the sense.
Yes.
And the fundamentals of understanding consciousness are still a long way away.
Well, there you go. I mean, dare one as a neuroscientist sort of raise the spectre of trying to understand consciousness. I mean, it's the great goal, and we may get there eventually. But I think it's very interesting you should raise the term consciousness, because as we understand more about sleep, our understandings about consciousness, and indeed we have tended to think that consciousness is very much a human phenomenon. I think increasingly we're finding that perhaps consciousness can be extended, throughout many groups of animals, which raises lots of interesting and ethical questions indeed.
Indeed, yes. So one of the aspects of Victorian research on sleep linked to food, because previously they'd always thought that sleeplessness was connected with digestion, whether you'd eaten cheese, etc. But during the Victorian period, they managed to discover how long various foods took to digest. And from then on, you got endless self-help manuals on what you should eat before you go to bed and what's the most difficult to digest, etc., and what will give you nightmares. And then they started to develop all sorts of commercial drinks for helping you to sleep through the night. And then I think it was the 1920s, this finally emerged into the concept of night starvation. And I remember my great uncle used to take piles of foods and boiled eggs and all sorts of things that he would eat if he thought he was hungry during the night, which of course he always was.
Well, that's again so interesting, because one of the great topics in sleep and circadian research at the moment is metabolism and the link between clocks, sleep and metabolism. And the discovery that if you take a big meal in the morning, you can deal with it and you can clear the glucose. But if you take the same level of calories in the evening, then the levels of glucose hang around for much longer. And indeed, it's been associated with the development of things like diabetes too. And and my grandparents, born in the Edwardian era, I remember, what they used to do is take an apple and a hunk of bread and a big chunk of cheese and a big glass of water by the bedside.
Yes,
and it was always gone in the
same.
morning. Yes.
Yes.
One of the other things about the Victorians, though, and I guess this relates to some of their artistic depictions and their thoughts about dreaming. Where does that fit in within the Victorian sort of thoughts about sleep?
Yes, so the Romantics, which is the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, were really preoccupied by dreams and nightmares. And that then fed through into the 19th century when they suddenly thought, well, now that we have all these techniques, we can actually start to understand what is happening. And yes, it isn't simply the undigested food, but it also for them linked very much into their research into ideas of consciousness. And they came up with all sorts of levels of consciousness and also what they called waking dreams. So they thought there was a complete continuum, and that the thoughts of the day very much followed through during the night. And they were fascinated by the possibilities that this produced.
Well, we still don't know what dreams are for. I mean, I have a very sort of pragmatic approach that this is essentially an artifact of the brain trying to process information, make sense of the day. What we do know, of course, is the most complicated and vivid dreams seem to be during REM sleep. But we also dream during slow wave sleep as well. But again, I don't think any of us would say that they have predictive power, as perhaps they thought in the 19th century. I don't know, did they?
Oh, some people did, yes, definitely. And it was linked to the Society for Psychical Research, which a lot of major scientists were involved in.
Yeah.
Because so many things seem to be coming true. You know, if you've got electricity and you produce telegraphs that can send messages across the world, you know, why shouldn't these things be possible? So you can see why there was such an interest.
Yeah. So drawing upon your research and your own personal understanding, what do you think's most important? You know, in the way that young people study versus sleep, is there a conflict here? What are your thoughts on sleep versus study?
Well, I think I will answer as most people would answer, in that you have to get the balance.
Yeah.
But that studying long into the night simply to cram in is the most ineffective way you could possibly have for producing both good academic work and also good sleep.
I absolutely agree. And in fact, you know, it goes back to, again, our grandparents, you know, sleep on it. I mean, that's what they used to say. And now we have the evidence base to show that the solving of problems, the consolidation of memory, and so many other brain faculties are dependent upon a good night of sleep. So I think I would absolutely agree. If you want to study well, you have to study, but you also have to get that good night of sleep.
Yes.